Good morning. Tonight's report centers on a revelation that has unsettled royal observers and raised questions inside Britain's most closely watched institution. It involves Sir Timothy Laurence, the reserved and disciplined husband of Princess Anne, who, according to credible accounts, overheard words that could alter perceptions of Queen Camilla and her role at the heart of the monarchy. The timeline begins at Royal Ascot in June 2025. This annual event, a symbol of continuity and national tradition, became the backdrop for something far more serious than horse racing. The king appeared in public alongside Queen Camilla. While official medical briefings had painted a cautiously optimistic picture, the king's pallor and visible fatigue told another story. He was determined, but frail. The public, however, directed their energy elsewhere, towards the Prince and Princess of Wales. Prince William was steady, confident, applauded as a leader in waiting. Princess Catherine, recovering from major surgery, was praised as a figure of resilience. Together, they drew ovations that many commentators described as a rehearsal for the next reign. Headlines the following day confirmed the impression. The Waleses were seen as the future, not a distant one, but an imminent one. Against this backdrop, Queen Camilla maintained her usual composure. To the cameras, she smiled politely, but to at least one listener nearby, the moment was defined not by appearances, but by a remark delivered in a low but deliberate tone. Sir Timothy Laurence, known for his naval discipline and discretion, is said to have caught her words. They were simple but decisive. "This throne must remain under my control." Observers describe Sir Timothy's reaction as immediate, though contained. To him, this was not the voice of a concerned spouse. It was a declaration of intent. Having spent decades inside environments where one phrase can signal an entire strategy, he recognized the weight behind those words. Protocol would have demanded silence. Yet Sir Timothy is not only a former vice admiral, he is the husband of the Princess Royal, one of the monarchy's most steadfast guardians. Princess Anne has long been clear in her assessments, unafraid to speak bluntly when duty requires it. The suggestion that her sister-in-law might be positioning herself to retain influence, even as succession pressures intensified, could not be dismissed as idle talk. The context deepened the concern. Charles's illness, first disclosed publicly in 2024, remained the subject of constant speculation. Palace updates stressed stability, but public perception was shifting toward preparation for transition. In that climate, any attempt to consolidate control, even discreetly, carried serious implications. Sir Timothy's decision was clear. He would not rush forward with accusations, but neither would he ignore what he had heard. He resolved to investigate quietly, to test whether this remark was isolated or part of a larger pattern. His approach would reflect his training: verify, cross-check, confirm. The next step took him back in time, through the perspective of someone who knew Queen Camilla long before she entered Clarence House as consort. That contact was Andrew Parker Bowles, her former husband. For decades, Andrew had remained silent about the inner dynamics of his marriage. But when approached discreetly, in a private London setting, he agreed to speak. His testimony, according to this account, would prove crucial. Before detailing that conversation, it is important to note how the matter stood by then. In a single day at Ascot, the monarchy had presented its future, its vulnerability, and, if this report is accurate, its internal fault line. William and Catherine symbolized renewal. Charles symbolized endurance under strain. Camilla, smiling yet tense, symbolized continuity, but also, potentially, ambition. And in the middle of it all, almost by accident, stood Sir Timothy Laurence, no longer just a quiet consort, but a witness whose discretion could shape what happened next. From that moment, the story was no longer about applause at a racecourse. It was about whether the monarchy's stability was being reinforced or manipulated. And the only way to know was to follow where the evidence led. The investigation, as reconstructed in this report, moved from the spectacle of Ascot to the quiet corridors of Clarence House. If the first signal was a whispered phrase at a public event, the next would come from behind closed doors, where the monarch's health and the nation's expectations intersected. At the center of this stage was a physician, an oncologist of long-standing repute, and a consort determined to shape outcomes according to her own calculations. In mid-2025, the king's condition was already a matter of national concern. Official bulletins issued by the palace spoke of encouraging progress, yet those who saw him up close remarked on his visible fatigue, his weight loss, and the lines of exhaustion deepening around his eyes. It was a portrait that did not fully align with the optimistic phrasing of press releases. Dr. Michael Harrington, a consultant known for his rigorous standards, is said to have delivered a stark assessment in private. His advice was clinical and unequivocal. Intensify the treatment. Without escalation, stronger chemotherapy and new regimens, the king's prognosis would darken rapidly. The recommendation was not framed in speculation, but in data, scans, and test results. According to those close to the medical team, it was the only responsible course of action. Yet the account we follow introduces a second voice in that consultation, Queen Camilla's. The version of events described by insiders is clear. She rejected the recommendation. Her reasoning, as reconstructed, was political rather than medical. A healthier monarch, fully treated and possibly recovering strength, would sooner or later face mounting calls to abdicate in favor of his son. The Waleses, already celebrated as the face of the future, would assume center stage. In that scenario, her role would shrink overnight. But a monarch kept weak, present but subdued, would allow her to remain the visible stabilizer, the quiet power behind the throne. The confrontation between doctor and consort is said to have been sharp. Harrington insisted that withholding treatment could shorten the king's life. He invoked his professional oath and duty. Camilla, the account claims, responded with a countermeasure rooted in influence. She warned of consequences for his career, his reputation, even his family, should he defy her wishes or disclose the true state of the king's condition. The atmosphere, according to one who later heard fragments of the exchange, was suffocating. Harrington, a man of long professional standing, faced a choice that was not medical at all. By the end of the conversation, he lowered his head and accepted her instruction. The course of treatment would remain minimal, enough to allow appearances, too little to promise recovery. For Sir Timothy Laurence, these were still fragments. He did not hear the conversation directly. What he gathered came through naval contacts tied loosely to medical staff and from patterns he observed. Upbeat statements issued to the press, while the king himself appeared increasingly worn, private consultations that occurred without staff present, whispered remarks at Ascot that seemed to echo in each subsequent decision. Individually, none of these pieces would stand as proof. Collectively, they suggested interference. Princess Anne, when briefed by her husband, offered a response in keeping with her reputation. Firm, direct, unsentimental. If this is ambition, it must be checked, she said, according to the account. If it is interference with treatment, it must be stopped. That is the line. Her words set the investigation on a sharper course. What began as curiosity hardened into a duty to confirm or disprove. Sir Timothy's task became not merely listening but documenting, assembling enough to present to those with authority to act. At the same time, the narrative records a shift on the other side. Camilla, aware of scrutiny, began tightening her own circle. Security aides were instructed to monitor conversations, note movements, and above all to keep track of Sir Timothy. He had been too attentive at Ascot, too persistent in asking quiet questions afterward. Invisibility had once been his shield. Now it marked him as a risk. The report then describes a pivotal night in early September. Sir Timothy visited Clarence House on official pretext, supposedly to discuss charitable engagements, but with the assistance of a long-serving palace attendant, he was led down a service corridor. From behind a half-open door, He observed what the account calls a defining scene. The king sat weakened in a private study, surrounded by papers. Among them were documents of power of attorney, linked to financial portfolios originally designated by the late Queen Elizabeth for Princess Anne. The purpose was to ensure her charitable endeavours would be properly funded. In this moment, however, the documents were being redirected. Camilla, voice softened in tone but sharp in intent, urged Charles to sign. The king hesitated, insisting that the assets belonged to his sister in accordance with his mother's wishes. But persuasion gave way to pressure. The Queen, according to this narrative, warned him that if he refused, she would disclose the true extent of his illness to the public. Such a revelation, she implied, would destabilize the monarchy, leaving him remembered not for resilience but for weakness. After a pause described as heavy with guilt, the king signed. His hand trembled, his expression one of defeat. It was not, according to the witness, the decision of a man acting freely. It was the concession of a sovereign worn down by illness and cornered by circumstance. Hidden from view, Sir Timothy felt the gravity of the moment. He had witnessed something that went beyond rumour or suspicion. It was no longer a matter of speculation but of leverage, financial, medical, and personal. He left Clarence House with a clenched jaw and silent fury, his naval discipline the only force keeping him from confrontation. What followed intensified the crisis further. A palace staffer named Edward Thompson, long trusted and connected to the late Queen, approached Sir Timothy on a stormy September night. Nervous, glancing over his shoulder, Edward handed over a small device. On it, he said, was video evidence recorded secretly in the king's medical quarters. When played, the footage confirmed the whispers. It showed Camilla instructing Dr. Harrington to maintain the king in a state of weakness, balancing appearances with incapacity. The doctor, shoulders heavy, nodded reluctantly. His professional authority was reduced to silence. For Sir Timothy, this was the decisive proof. A whispered phrase at Ascot, troubling medical patterns, financial pressure in the study, all of it now aligned with recorded evidence. The case was no longer circumstantial, it was documented. He made copies of the files, storing them in multiple secure locations. To Edward, he offered reassurance and protection, but within days, Edward disappeared. No official announcement was made. His absence was noted quietly, with unease. For Tim, it became personal. The risk had already claimed one man's safety. To waste that sacrifice would be intolerable. At this stage, the narrative describes Sir Timothy as transformed. Once the quietest figure in the royal circle, he now carried the heaviest responsibility. He was not acting for himself, but for Anne, for the king, and for the continuity of the crown. The next step would no longer be quiet inquiry. It would be escalation, upward, to those with the authority to convene, to deliberate, and to decide. Thus, the scene is set for a confrontation that moves beyond whispers and witness. It is prepared for the forum of royal councils, where evidence meets judgment and where secrecy must give way to action. The narrative, by this stage, had moved from suspicion into evidence and from private discomfort into imminent crisis. What began with a whispered phrase at Ascot had grown into a dossier, conversations overheard, documents coerced, and now a recording that confirmed interference in the king's medical care. Sir Timothy Laurence, once the most discreet figure in the royal circle, now found himself at the centre of a storm that could not remain hidden. According to the account, the decisive moment came in mid-September. The weather was heavy with rain as Sir Timothy drove home from London, having met another discreet source. In his rearview mirror, he noticed headlights closing in fast. A black vehicle, unmarked, accelerated aggressively. Within moments, the situation was clear. This was no ordinary traffic incident. Naval instincts, sharpened by years at sea, told him he was being forced off the road. The vehicle struck his car's rear quarter panel. Sir Timothy reacted instantly, steering hard, then throwing himself from the passenger door before the impact carried his vehicle into a gully. The car crashed among trees, mangled in the darkness. Sir Timothy, bruised and bloodied, survived on instinct. Gasping for breath in the rain-soaked mud, he realized the implication. This was not an accident. It was an attempt to eliminate him. He called Princess Anne immediately. Reports describe her arriving in haste, anger mixing with fear. "They tried to kill you," she is said to have exclaimed. Her response, however, was not panic but determination. "We end this now," she told her husband, "before she prevails." The escalation was unmistakable. What had been a shadow conflict now became, in Sir Timothy's words, a war for survival. He resolved to escalate to the only figure who could command institutional authority beyond suspicion, Prince William, heir to the throne. The communication was secure, routed through channels designed to prevent interception. When briefed, William's reaction was one of controlled fury. "Did she try to kill you?" he asked, in disbelief at the gravity of the claim. Confronted with the files, the testimony, and the attempted crash, his conclusion was immediate. This could no longer be managed quietly. It required an official reckoning. Yet, even as the alliance solidified, Anne, Tim, and William, forming a triangle of resolve, the narrative records a tragic loss. Edward Thompson, the loyal staffer who had provided the decisive recording, vanished. His disappearance was never explained publicly. To those inside the circle, it was confirmation of the danger. His sacrifice, however, deepened their determination. The video he had provided would not be buried with him. It would be presented, in full, to those with the power to act. The next development was historic: the decision to convene a private royal council. Such a meeting, rarely called in modern times, would include the heir, senior advisors, palace lawyers, and government officials. Its purpose would be simple: to weigh the evidence, test its credibility, and determine whether the monarchy itself had been compromised from within. In preparation, roles were divided. Prince William, as future sovereign, would present the case. Princess Anne would carry her mother's will and related documents, proving the financial assets intended for her charitable foundations had been misappropriated. Sir Timothy would serve as witness, recounting what he had heard at Ascot, what he had observed at Clarence House, and what he had endured on the rain-slicked road. Together, their aim was to lay out a sequence so compelling that the council could not ignore it. The session convened in late September at Buckingham Palace, inside a secure chamber rarely used since the late Queen's reign. The atmosphere, according to those familiar, was tense, heavy, and disciplined. William spoke first, setting the tone as a leader in waiting. He did not dramatize, he presented. He played the recording of Camilla's meeting with Dr. Harrington, her voice instructing him to maintain the king in weakness. He described the pattern of misleading medical bulletins. He laid out the financial documents, showing how Charles had been pressured into signing away control of portfolios that rightly belonged to Anne. He included Sir Timothy's eyewitness account of that coercion, and then, with quiet anger, he recounted the attempted car crash, framing it not as speculation, but as a direct attempt to silence a witness. The council listened in silence. When the footage played, one advisor reportedly looked away, unsettled by the bluntness of the words. Palace lawyers examined the documents, their faces grave. For 3 hours, the group debated, argued, and weighed. In the end, the conclusion was unanimous. The Queen Consort's actions, if disclosed publicly in detail, would destabilize the monarchy, but they could not be tolerated in silence. An official letter was drafted overnight, cold and final. It was delivered to Clarence House the next morning. The letter informed Queen Camilla that her executive duties were suspended immediately. Control of finances was to be restored to Princess Anne and Prince William. She would retain the ceremonial title of Queen Consort, but would no longer exercise authority. Publicly, the palace would announce that she was stepping back, for health reasons, to support the king. Privately, her influence was over. Accounts describe her reading the letter in silence, hands trembling. For decades she had endured criticism, fought for acceptance, and finally stood beside Charles as queen. Now, in a single document, that authority was gone. She was left with the title but not the power, a consort without a kingdom. The institution moved quickly to stabilize. Palace communications emphasized continuity. The king continued to appear in public, supported visibly by William and Catherine. Media speculation flared but was contained. The official line was clear: the Queen Consort was stepping back. The truth of the council's decision remained sealed behind the palace walls. For Sir Timothy, the outcome was both victory and burden. At a charity event days later, he appeared beside Princess Anne, as discreet as ever. Observers noticed her holding his hand tightly. "You saved him," she was heard to say. "You saved us all." It was the closest thing to public recognition he would ever seek. Thus, the narrative closes Part 3 with a quiet resolution. The Queen Consort remained in place but stripped of authority. The king was protected, his legacy secured. The heir, tested by crisis, proved his readiness. And the man who had once lived entirely in the background, Princess Anne's husband, emerged as the unlikely guardian of the crown. The events that unfolded inside Buckingham Palace at the close of September 2025 marked a rare moment in modern royal history. For decades, the monarchy has thrived on ceremony, symbolism, and continuity. But in this case, continuity depended on intervention. A private royal council, convened in utmost secrecy, delivered a judgment that effectively reshaped the balance of power within the House of Windsor. The session itself lasted just over 3 hours, according to accounts shared later by insiders. Participants included Prince William, senior legal advisors, senior courtiers, and government liaisons who had long maintained quiet channels with the palace. The evidence presented was not tabloid rumor, not anonymous speculation, but a body of material cross-checked and corroborated. Audio-visual recordings, signed documents, first-hand testimony. Prince William opened the proceedings. Those present describe his tone as calm, deliberate, and markedly statesmanlike. He began not with accusations, but with a review of the facts. He reminded the council of the king's diagnosis, the public statements of progress, and the observable reality of decline. Then he introduced the first item of evidence, a video recorded by Edward Thompson, the late staffer. The footage, played on a secure monitor, captured a conversation between Queen Camilla and Dr. Michael Harrington. The words were unmistakable, an instruction to maintain the king in a weakened state, calibrated to allow public appearances without real recovery. Reactions in the room varied. Some sat motionless. Others exchanged glances of shock. A legal advisor requested the clip be replayed. On second hearing, the words carried even greater weight. Harrington's resigned demeanor confirmed what his silence in public could not. The doctor, in that moment, was trapped between professional oath and personal survival. Next came the financial documents. Princess Anne laid them on the table herself. They were signed under duress, she explained. Funds and charitable assets assigned to her under her mother's will had been reallocated through powers of attorney extracted in a moment of weakness. Those present reviewed the signatures. The king's hand, unsteady, told its own story. One lawyer remarked quietly that no court would accept such a document as evidence of free consent. Finally, Sir Timothy Laurence delivered his testimony. Reserved as ever, he described the Ascot remark, the private confrontation he witnessed at Clarence House, and the near-fatal crash that left his car wrecked in a ditch. He spoke with the precision of a naval officer, times, dates, locations, avoiding speculation, offering only what he observed and what he endured. At this point, the council was faced with 3 pillars: manipulation of medical care, coercion in financial matters, and direct attempts to intimidate or silence a witness. Each on its own would have raised alarm. Together, they left no room for ambiguity. The debate that followed was intense. Some argued for discretion, fearing public scandal and destabilization. Others insisted that inaction would itself be destabilizing. What bound them all was recognition of duty, not to individuals, but to the Crown as an institution. After hours of deliberation, consensus emerged. A letter would be drafted, direct and final. It would not air allegations publicly, nor would it expose the monarchy to unnecessary spectacle. But it would remove Queen Camilla's authority completely. The letter was delivered the next morning to Clarence House. Accounts of its reception describe a scene of silence broken only by the sound of trembling paper. The Queen Consort read the words carefully. They were not accusatory, but they were unambiguous. Her executive functions were suspended indefinitely. Financial control was to revert to Princess Anne and Prince William. Her role would be purely ceremonial. She would remain beside the king in appearance, but behind the scenes, her influence was ended. For Camilla, it was a devastating reversal. Observers close to her describe her staring into a mirror for a long moment, reflecting on a lifetime spent weathering public criticism and private challenges, only to see her authority dissolve in one stroke. For half a century, she had fought to stand as queen. Now, in practice, she was little more than a figurehead. The palace moved swiftly to frame the development. Official communications announced that the Queen Consort was stepping back from certain duties, for health reasons, allowing her to support the king during treatment. To the public, it sounded like a compassionate adjustment. Inside the council chamber, everyone knew it was a decisive removal. Media outlets speculated but could not confirm. Tabloids questioned why such a sudden change had occurred. Commentators noted the rising visibility of William and Catherine, who now took on more prominent roles at engagements. Yet the truth of the council's findings remained sealed, shared only among a handful of participants, and recorded in confidential files. For Sir Timothy Laurence, the outcome carried both relief and burden. He had acted not as a politician, not as a courtier, but as a man who recognized a line crossed and chose to intervene. He emerged with scars, physical from the crash, emotional from the weight of secrecy, but with the knowledge that he had preserved both the king and the crown. Princess Anne, never given to public displays of sentiment, allowed herself one brief moment at a charity event. Holding her husband's hand, she said quietly, "You saved him. You saved us all." Those nearby reported it as the only acknowledgement Sir Timothy ever sought. In the weeks that followed, the monarchy projected stability. King Charles continued limited appearances. The Prince and Princess of Wales grew more visible, praised for embodying modern leadership. Princess Anne, as always, carried her duties with unflinching resolve. And Sir Timothy returned to the background, content to let history record events in its own time. The Queen Consort remained in place, but without authority. Her long struggle for influence ended not with triumph, but with silence, her public smile concealing a private loss. This was the council's verdict. To preserve the monarchy, one voice had to be set aside. And that verdict, delivered quietly but firmly, ensured that the institution endured. The weeks that followed, the council's decision unfolded in a rhythm of deliberate calm. The monarchy, conscious of its image and the weight of public expectation, moved to project stability above all else. Official statements emphasized continuity, duty, and resilience. Behind the facade, however, the dynamics of power had shifted irreversibly. The king, still under treatment, appeared at select public events. Each appearance was carefully staged. He stood beside his son and daughter-in-law, supported visibly by the Prince and Princess of Wales. Catherine, radiant after her recovery, represented resilience. William, steady and deliberate, embodied preparation for the next chapter. Together, they reassured the public that the monarchy was not faltering, but adapting. Observers noted that the Queen Consort's presence was more restrained. She attended by the king's side, but without the active role she once sought. Her schedule was lightened, her influence curtailed. To the outside world, This was explained as a compassionate adjustment to ease her responsibilities. To those who had witnessed the private deliberations at Buckingham Palace, it was the visible mark of an authority removed. The palace communications strategy proved effective. Headlines praised the king's determination, celebrated Catherine's return, and remarked on William's readiness. The narrative that might have destabilized the institution was quietly redirected. The Queen Consort's retreat from decision-making was framed as supportive rather than punitive. Most of the public accepted the explanation. The true story remained locked behind the council's doors. Inside the royal household, however, the atmosphere was different. Princess Anne, seasoned by decades of service, carried herself with her usual composure. Yet she knew the magnitude of what had been averted. Her late mother's instructions regarding charitable portfolios had been preserved. The king's health, though fragile, was no longer being compromised for political gain. And the future of the crown had been safeguarded by decisive action. At her side, Sir Timothy Laurence returned to his characteristic reserve. He did not seek credit, nor did he offer comment, but those close enough to observe knew the truth. He had become the quiet pivot in a crisis that could have torn the institution apart. From the overheard words at Ascot to the evidence collected discreetly to the near-fatal attempt on his life, he had endured and persisted. His naval discipline had served the monarchy when it was most vulnerable. Prince William, too, emerged from the ordeal changed. The heir had been tested not in ceremony, but in confrontation. He had presided over a council that stripped power from a sitting consort, a decision unprecedented in the modern era. He did so with composure and clarity, convincing senior advisors and government liaisons alike. In the eyes of many insiders, this confirmed his readiness not just to inherit the throne, but to protect it. For Queen Camilla, the aftermath was stark. Outwardly, she remained Queen Consort. She appeared in public beside her husband, offering smiles and polite gestures. Inwardly, she was reduced to a figurehead. Decades of perseverance had culminated not in consolidation of power, but in isolation. Her ambition, once a driving force, now stood as a private burden. Accounts describe her spending long hours in solitude, reflecting on the collapse of a 5-decade pursuit. The institution, meanwhile, focused on preservation. The official narrative was carefully maintained. The Queen Consort was stepping back for health reasons. The Prince and Princess of Wales were taking on greater responsibility. The King remained the symbol of continuity. The public, reassured by the sight of William and Catherine, largely accepted this explanation. The monarchy's image endured intact. In historical terms, what happened in September 2025 may never be recorded in official archives. The files of the council remain sealed. The footage provided by Edward Thompson, the staffer who disappeared, remains in secure custody. And the attempted crash on a rain-swept London road is remembered only by those who were directly involved. The official record will speak only of a Queen Consort reducing her duties, a king continuing treatment, and an heir stepping forward. Yet for those who understand the deeper reality, the legacy is clear. The monarchy survived not because of spectacle or ceremony, but because individuals acted quietly and decisively. Princess Anne stood firm in her role as guardian of her brother and the institution. Prince William demonstrated the judgment of a future king, and Sir Timothy Laurence, long in the shadows, proved to be the quiet defender who held the line when others could not. The closing image of this narrative is not one of confrontation, but of calm, a charity event, modest and understated. Princess Anne standing with her husband, hand clasped tightly in his. Reporters noted her rare gesture of public affection. "You saved him," she was heard to say softly. "You saved us all." Sir Timothy, characteristically, said nothing in reply. He simply stood, steady as always, a man content to let others carry the spotlight. Thus, the story ends where it began, not in headlines or drama, but in duty. A whispered phrase at a racecourse set events in motion. Evidence confirmed suspicion, a council delivered judgment, and a monarchy, threatened from within, endured. The legacy of that summer is measured not in scandal, but in survival. It is the reminder that even in the oldest of institutions, stability depends on vigilance, and that sometimes the quietest figures prove to be the most decisive.